They were not supposed to be found, and perhaps that is why their discovery still feels like an accident history is trying to forget. In the late 19th century, beneath layers of Mesopotamian soil baked hard by centuries of sun, archaeologists began pulling fragments of clay etched with strange, deliberate symbols. At first glance, they looked unremarkable, easily dismissed as administrative records or ritual hymns. But as the tablets were cleaned, cataloged, and slowly translated, a far more unsettling picture emerged. These were not myths in the poetic sense. They read like records. Names were listed, events were dated, instructions were given. The tablets spoke of beings who descended from the heavens, of cities planned before they were built, and of humanity described not as a divine miracle, but as a solution to a problem. This was the Anunnaki narrative, and it did not fit anywhere it was supposed to. What made the discovery disturbing was not just what the tablets claimed, but how quickly they were dismissed. Labels like symbolic, ceremonial, and purely mythological appeared almost immediately in academic circles, long before full translations were complete. The speed of that rejection raised an uncomfortable question. How could something be so confidently ignored? Institutions that shape historical consensus treated the tablets like an inconvenience. Museums displayed them quietly. Universities translated selectively. Religious authorities avoided them entirely. It was as if an unspoken agreement had formed, one that said some doors, once cracked open, must be shut again, because if the tablets were taken seriously, they threatened more than timelines. They challenged origins and hinted that humanity's story did not begin with divine intention, but with external intervention. That possibility, once introduced, could not be controlled. So the tablets were buried again, not in the earth, but in footnotes, archives, and dismissive language, forgotten by the public. Waiting for the moment someone would ask why records this strange were never meant to be read today. The problem did not appear all at once. It crept in quietly, line by line, as the early translators began comparing the tablets to the timelines everyone thought they understood. Dates emerged that stretched far beyond biblical creation. Flood accounts appeared that predated Noah. Creation itself was described not as a singular divine act, but as a sequence of decisions, revisions, and failures. And for scholars trained within rigid frameworks, this was not discovery, it was danger. Some translators hesitated, others backtracked. Notes were softened, conclusions blurred, words like literal vanished, replaced by allegorical and ceremonial. Yet, privately, correspondence between researchers revealed confusion and alarm. If these tablets were accurate records, then sacred chronology was not just incomplete, it was overwritten. That realization traveled quickly to institutions whose authority depended on continuity. Religious timelines are not flexible stories. They are foundations. Move the beginning, and everything above it shifts. The Anunnaki texts did not merely add an earlier chapter. They implied that later scriptures were adaptations, not revelations. This is when interest turned into containment. Funding for certain translations quietly dried up. Promising research careers stalled. Entire sections of tablets were labeled redundant or damaged, even when they were intact. Suppression did not arrive with fire or decrees, but with silence. Because myths are harmless until they compete with truth. The moment a story threatens to explain more clearly than doctrine, it stops being tolerated. The Anunnaki narrative suggested a world where gods were fallible, power was technological, and humanity was shaped with intent rather than love. That idea could not coexist with absolute divinity. So the tablets were reframed as stories, their sharp edges dulled. Yet beneath that soft language, the threat remained, waiting for anyone brave enough to notice that something essential had been pushed aside. History rarely erases evidence accidentally, or when patterns repeat across centuries, dismissal itself becomes a signal that something powerful fears being remembered by those controlling the story of beginnings entirely. When the Anunnaki tablets entered scholarly awareness, one institution responded not with argument, but absence. The Vatican never issued formal condemnations, never released counter studies, never engaged in open debate. Instead, there was silence, a silence that echoed across decades whenever Sumerian origins brushed too closely against Christian beginnings. This pattern was not new. Throughout history, the Church had spoken loudly against threats it considered dangerous. Yet, with these tablets, there were no councils, no papal decrees, no fiery rebuttals. The subject simply dissolved before it reached the public conversation. Researchers noticed it. Journalists noticed it. Questions were asked, then quietly abandoned. The Vatican's archives, vast and famously inaccessible, became the center of speculation. Scholars wondered how many translations, commentaries, or comparative studies already existed behind sealed doors. Ancient languages were not foreign to the Church. It had preserved Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin texts for centuries. To assume Sumerian was beyond its reach felt naive. What unsettled critics most was not opposition, but familiarity. References surfaced of early theologians aware of Mesopotamian myths long before modern archaeology. Certain symbols, stories, and hierarchies seemed to reappear with careful adjustments, as if inherited rather than invented. Coincidence became harder to defend. Silence, in this context, began to feel strategic. Indoor speaking would invite comparison. Comparison would invite questions, and questions, once asked widely enough, could fracture certainty. The Church had survived by shaping narratives, not reacting to them. So the tablets remained outside the conversation, hovering like a shadow near the foundations of faith. And that led to the most unsettling thought of all. Silence is not ignorance. Sometimes it is recognition. Sometimes it is the quiet response of an institution that does not need to investigate because it already knows exactly what it would find. And if knowledge was once guarded to protect belief, the unanswered question lingers. Was faith built to reveal truth or to contain it until humanity was ready to face a past far older and far less divine than promised by its keepers? Jan Sumer does not ease into history. It appears abruptly, I fully formed, without the slow trial and error that defines every other known civilization. One moment there are scattered Neolithic villages. The next there are cities with sewage systems, legal codes, monumental architecture, and a writing system capable of recording contracts, prayers, and astronomical calculations. For historians, this sudden leap has always been uncomfortable. The Sumerians charted the movements of planets with a precision that would not reappear for thousands of years. They divided time into hours, minutes, and seconds, mapped the heavens into constellations, and encoded mathematical systems based on 60 that modern science still relies upon. These were not primitive experiments. They were refinements, as if the knowledge had been handed down already tested. Even more puzzling was their concept of law. The earliest legal codes were not reactive. They were structured, philosophical, and predictive. Society was organized as if its architects already understood human behavior in detail. Cities were planned with intention, temples aligned with celestial events, and records kept with obsessive accuracy. There is no clear developmental trail leading to this. No gradual buildup of failed ideas, no visible ancestors struggling toward literacy. Sumer arrives like an answer without a question, a finished blueprint placed into the hands of a people who suddenly knew exactly who they were and how the world worked. And that raises the question scholars rarely linger on. If this knowledge was not developed slowly, then where did it come from? And why does history insist on pretending that this mystery does not exist? Where archaeology offers no missing steps, no broken ladders of progress, only a sudden summit reached without a visible climb, leaving historians to quietly admit that something essential is absent from the official story. This absence lingers like an unmarked chapter, suggesting guidance, instruction, or intervention that conventional models cannot comfortably explain without collapsing their own assumptions. It remains a question nobody is trained to answer. The Sumerians never described their gods as distant or unknowable. The Anunnaki were present, physical, and involved. They arrived, they instructed, they ruled. The tablets speak of descent from the heavens, of luminous vehicles that moved between sky and ground, and of beings who possessed authority enforced by power rather than faith. These were not symbolic deities representing abstract forces. They issued commands, demanded labor, and punished disobedience. They wore garments, carried tools, and occupied specific locations. The language used is procedural, not poetic. It reads less like worship and more like reporting. The Anunnaki were said to have created humanity to serve, not to adore. Humans were engineered to work, to maintain cities, and to extract resources. This relationship was hierarchical and unmistakable. Obedience was expected, not belief. The gods did not ask for faith. They required compliance. What makes this unsettling is how familiar these descriptions become when compared to later religious figures. Sky beings, divine messengers, fiery chariots, voices from above issuing law. The imagery survives, but the context changes. Technology becomes miracle. Authority becomes holiness. The Sumerians did not kneel before mystery. They documented power. And in doing so, they left behind accounts that blur the line between gods and something far more tangible, something later cultures would struggle to explain without rewriting entirely. Descriptions of these beings include precise measurements, ranks, and jurisdictions, implying administration rather than mythology, as if power was organized, delegated, and enforced through systems humanity later attempted to imitate. What is rarely emphasized is how little mysticism appears in the original language, which avoids metaphor and instead favors clarity, repetition, and instruction over wonder or spiritual ambiguity. This tone suggests witnesses recording authority they could neither challenge nor fully comprehend. Leaving behind testimony later generations would reinterpret as religion to make sense of power. In that transformation, explanation was replaced by reverence and memory became myth, yet the original words still resist that transformation. When the dates are placed side by side, the discomfort becomes impossible to ignore. Sumerian king lists and creation accounts extend back tens of thousands of years, describing eras before floods, before resets, before humanity as it is now. These timelines do not align with biblical Genesis. They overwhelm it. According to Sumerian records, civilization existed long before the world was supposedly created. Cities rose, fell, and rose again in cycles that predate Adam by millennia. The flood was not the beginning of history, but a disruption within it. Survival was selective, memory was controlled. This forces a question that destabilizes everything built upon sacred chronology. If the Sumerian accounts came first, then later scriptures are not origins, but adaptations. Familiar stories appear with altered characters, simplified motives, and compressed timelines. Borrowing is not inherently suspicious. Cultures share stories, but borrowing becomes troubling when it is denied, and when the earlier version contains details the later one removes. The Anunnaki narrative explains process. Genesis delivers outcome. Once that comparison is seen, it cannot be unseen. One account reads like a record of events. The other reads like a refined doctrine. And history, standing between them, is left to answer an unsettling possibility. That the beginning humanity was taught to remember is not the beginning at all, but a carefully chosen restart. Chronology becomes dangerous when it contradicts belief because dates are harder to spiritualize than symbols, and numbers refuse to bend to doctrine without leaving visible fractures behind. The farther back the Sumerian records extend, the more they expose the fragility of a single absolute beginning, replacing it with cycles, interruptions, and recoveries that feel uncomfortably realistic. If history has been reset before, then origins are not sacred moments, but administrative decisions, chosen starts designed to control memory rather than preserve truth. That possibility reframes Scripture itself as a boundary, marking how far humanity is permitted to look backward. Beyond it lies a past that refuses to remain buried, and refusal continues to unsettle history. As the language of the Anunnaki tablets is striking for what it does not contain. There are no pleas for faith, no calls for devotion, no emotional reverence that later religions would demand from their followers. Instead, the tone is administrative. Orders are issued, duties are assigned, consequences are outlined with unsettling clarity. Humanity is not asked to believe. Humanity is told to comply. The Anunnaki are described as rulers who governed through hierarchy. There were ranks among them, chains of command, overseers, and enforcers. Certain beings issued decrees, others carried them out. Humans existed at the bottom of this structure, created for specific functions, monitored for productivity, and disciplined when they failed. Punishment appears frequently in the tablets, not as divine wrath, but as enforcement. Disobedience resulted in labor, exile, or destruction. Entire cities were abandoned after falling out of favor. These were not moral judgments, they were administrative decisions. When humans rebelled or resisted, the response was swift and corrective. This is not the language of worship, it is the language of governance. The Anunnaki did not inspire devotion through mystery. They maintained control through presence and power. Their authority was visible, tangible, and impossible to ignore. What later religions would frame as divine law, the tablets describe as regulation. What would become commandments were once instructions, and what was later interpreted as faith began as survival under rulers who demanded obedience, not belief. That distinction matters because belief can be negotiated, obedience cannot. The Anunnaki ruled a system where questioning authority was not heresy, but malfunction. And the tablets preserve that truth in a tone so direct that it unsettles modern readers trained to see gods as symbolic rather than supervisory. In this world, humanity was managed, not inspired, and existence itself was conditional on performance rather than devotion. That framing changes everything about how power, divinity, and human purpose are understood. One of the most controversial elements of the Anunnaki tablets is not the existence of gods, but the description of creation itself. Humanity, according to these records, was not spoken into existence, it was assembled. The language describes trials, errors, revisions, and eventual success. Creation is portrayed as a technical achievement, not a miracle. So the tablets describe combining materials, refining forms, and correcting flaws. Early versions of humans failed. Some were physically unstable, others lacked cognition. Only after repeated attempts did a version emerge that could think, labor, and reproduce efficiently. This was not divine spontaneity. It was design. When this narrative is placed beside Genesis, the contrast is stark. The Bible offers the result without the method. Humanity exists because God wills it. No process is described, no experimentation acknowledged. The outcome remains, but the mechanics vanish. That omission raises questions. Why remove the process entirely while preserving the conclusion? Why transform a technical act into a sacred mystery? One account explains how. The other demands acceptance. The Anunnaki story implies limitation. It suggests creators who needed tools, time, and correction. Genesis presents perfection from the beginning. That shift is not subtle, it is ideological. By erasing the process, later texts remove the possibility that creation involved struggle, error, or design constraints. Humanity becomes sacred by default, not engineered by necessity. The result is comfort. The cost is truth. If humanity was designed, then purpose was assigned, not discovered. And that idea disrupts free will, divine love, and spiritual equality. It reframes existence as function. That is a perspective no religion built on transcendence could openly accept without unraveling its foundation entirely. The Anunnaki narrative does not merely challenge religion, it dismantles its core premise. Divine creation, as understood by centralized faiths, requires absolute authority, perfection, and intention rooted in love. The tablets offer none of these. They describe creators who were powerful but flawed, advanced but pragmatic, invested in outcomes rather than souls. If humanity was engineered, then creation was not sacred. It was strategic. And if creators were not omnipotent, then obedience was enforced, not deserved. That interpretation strips divinity of its mystery and replaces it with governance. Such a story could never be allowed to survive intact. Centralized religion depends on moral authority derived from transcendence. If gods are revealed as rulers operating within constraints, then faith becomes politics and worship becomes compliance. Rewriting was not optional, it was necessary. The narrative had to be purified, simplified, and elevated beyond scrutiny. Processes were removed, hierarchies were moralized, rulers became creators, commands became commandments. This transformation preserved control while erasing accountability. No longer could humans question design choices or rebel against authority grounded in visible power. Faith replaced memory. Belief replaced record. The Anunnaki tablets threaten this arrangement because they remember too much. They preserve a version of history where gods are not eternal truths, but participants in a system that can be examined, compared, and questioned. And once that possibility exists, centralized belief systems lose their monopoly on origin, purpose, and destiny. That is why the story had to be rewritten. Not because it was false, but because it explained too much, too clearly. In a way, no institution built on mystery could ever afford to allow humanity to fully remember. Long before Scripture was bound, recited, or declared sacred, its stories were already old. They existed in fragments of clay, pressed with reeds, baked by fire, and buried beneath cities that vanished long before Jerusalem was imagined. The flood, the garden, the fall, the divine watchers who intervened in human affairs, All of it appears first in Sumer, not as theology, but as memory. The Sumerian flood story describes a world reset by deliberate decision, not moral outrage. Humanity grows noisy, unmanageable, and inconvenient. The gods debate. A warning is issued to a chosen individual. A vessel is built. Life is preserved selectively. When the waters recede, civilization resumes under new rules. Thousands of years later, the same sequence reappears in Genesis, refined and moralized, stripped of debate, and reduced to obedience. The garden follows the same path. In Sumerian texts, humanity begins in a controlled environment where food is provided and labor is unnecessary. Knowledge is restricted. Boundaries are enforced. When humans gain forbidden awareness, the arrangement collapses. Exile follows. In Hebrew scripture, Eden becomes symbolic perfection, but the structure remains identical. Even fallen beings appear earlier than angels. Sumerian texts speak of divine figures who defied authority, taught forbidden knowledge, and altered humanity's trajectory. These entities are not demons. They are dissenters within a hierarchy. Later, they become fallen angels, their motives simplified, their knowledge condemned. The similarities are too precise to dismiss. Names change, motives shift, but the narrative skeleton remains intact. Scripture did not invent these stories, it inherited them, and inheritance implies selection. What survives is what aligns with power. What disappears is what complicates authority. The oldest stories were not written to inspire belief. They were written to preserve memory. Later texts transformed memory into morality, history into doctrine, ensuring that what was once recorded as events would be remembered only as lessons. That transformation marked the moment when truth became adaptable, shaped not by what happened first, but by what could be allowed to remain. Early religious texts did not emerge from monotheism. They emerged from crowded heavens. The oldest layers of Scripture reflect a world where divine authority was shared, debated, and contested. Multiple beings spoke, councils convened, decisions were made collectively. This echoes the Anunnaki hierarchy far more than later concepts of a singular, absolute God. Over time, this plurality was reduced, names vanished, roles merged. What had once been a group became a voice. Polytheism was not defeated by revelation, it was streamlined. Complexity was replaced with singular authority, not because the old gods disappeared, but because they became inconvenient. This transition did not happen accidentally. Linguistic traces remain embedded in Scripture, plural nouns paired with singular actions, echoes of older structures smoothed over by translation. Passages that once implied many were reinterpreted to affirm one. The reason is structural. A system governed by many allows comparison. A system ruled by one demands submission. Monotheism centralizes power not only in heaven, but on earth, where institutions claim to speak for the singular divine will. By removing competing gods, Scripture removed competing interpretations. Authority became absolute. Questioning became rebellion. Memory became heresy. This was not spiritual evolution, it was narrative engineering. Stories were edited not to reflect deeper truth, but to maintain control across generations. The gods were not disproven. They were absorbed, redefined, or erased. And in that erasure, humanity lost access to earlier explanations of its own origins, trading clarity for certainty and history for belief. What remains in Scripture is powerful. What is missing is revealing. Entire passages referenced by early writers no longer exist. Names appear without introduction. And events are implied but never explained. Gaps emerge where context should be. These absences are not random. They cluster around moments where divine authority appears divided, where creation seems procedural, or where humans interact with gods as subordinates rather than worshipers. Stories that suggest negotiation, failure, or dissent were removed or rewritten. The Book of Enoch survives outside the canon, describing watchers who altered humanity by teaching forbidden knowledge. Other texts mention divine councils and experiments and consequences that blur the line between God and ruler. These writings were not forgotten, they were excluded. Censorship does not always destroy, often, it preserves fragments while removing coherence. By isolating passages, by altering translations, by redefining terms, uncomfortable meanings are neutralized without obvious deletion. Evolution of belief is gradual and visible. Censorship is abrupt and selective. The pattern here suggests intent. The Anunnaki tablets expose what was lost by showing what came before editing. They preserve names, processes, and structures Scripture later simplified. They remind us that belief systems were shaped not only by inspiration, but by decisions about what humanity should and should not remember. And once memory is controlled, origin becomes permission, purpose becomes obedience, truth becomes whatever survives the edit. Beneath the stone and ceremony of Vatican City lies an archive so vast it defies casual description. Miles of shelves stretch underground, holding correspondence, reports, translations, and testimonies gathered across centuries. Officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, it remains one of the most restricted collections on Earth, accessible only to select scholars under strict supervision. What unsettles researchers is not simply that the archives are closed, but what is rumored to be inside. References appear in letters and inventories to texts older than Christianity itself, documents acquired as Rome absorbed earlier cultures rather than erasing them. When pagan temples were converted, their libraries often followed. Knowledge was not destroyed, it was collected. Requests to study materials related to ancient Mesopotamia, early cosmologies, and non-canonical creation accounts are routinely denied or delayed indefinitely. Permissions arrive, redacted. Files are missing. Entire catalog sections are unexplained gaps. For an institution dedicated to truth, the absence of transparency feels deliberate. The Church argues preservation requires protection, and that fragile documents cannot withstand scrutiny. Yet this caution seems selective. Other ancient texts are displayed proudly, translated repeatedly, and taught worldwide. The difference lies not in age, but implication. If the Anunnaki tablets echo themes already present in Vatican holdings, comparison becomes unavoidable. Comparison invites questions the Church has spent centuries resolving internally. The archive then functions less like a library and more like a vault, guarding continuity by controlling access. Knowledge does not need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only needs to be buried beneath authority, where it can exist without consequence. And beneath Rome, buried in silence and stone, lies the suggestion that history has already been read, weighed, and judged long before the public was allowed to ask what it might contain. Those unanswered shadows continue to fuel suspicion because secrecy itself becomes evidence when repetition, scale, and historical pattern suggest intention rather than coincidence to anyone willing to notice today, despite assurances offered publicly and calmly. Often, some documents are not locked away, they are left unfinished. Across museums, private collections and ecclesiastical holdings sit tablets and manuscripts that remain untranslated decades after their discovery. The explanation is always technical difficulty. The pattern suggests something else. Certain Sumerian tablets are translated only partially, with lines deemed damaged or repetitive, conveniently omitted. Apocryphal texts referenced by early theologians are acknowledged, then ignored. Scholars note that translation often stops precisely where creation narratives become procedural, where gods appear plural, or where authority looks administrative rather than divine. Translation is power. To translate is to frame meaning, to decide what language will allow others to think. By refusing to translate, institutions preserve ambiguity while preventing challenge. What cannot read cannot be debated. The church has historically sponsored translation when texts support doctrine. Greek philosophy was preserved, Hebrew scripture was refined, Roman history was cataloged. Silence appears only when alignment fails. After thousands of years, the danger is not belief collapse, but comparison. A translated tablet invites side-by-side reading. It invites readers to notice similarities, omissions, and adjustments. It invites memory. Untranslated texts exist in a strange limbo. They are acknowledged but inaccessible, cited but unread. Their silence speaks louder than refutation ever could. If nothing within them mattered, translation would pose no threat. The refusal suggests not uncertainty, but caution. And caution, repeated across centuries, implies awareness that some ideas, once spoken clearly, cannot be recontained. What remains locked is not language, but implication. The question persists. What truth requires this much protection, long after the civilizations that first recorded it turned to dust? Such restraint feels intentional, shaped by experience, reinforced by precedent, and justified through authority. Ensuring uncertainty survives while conclusions remain safely beyond reach for generations yet to come, who may otherwise ask why answers were delayed, avoided, or denied entirely without explanation or apology. Repeatedly, quietly, deliberately, over time, always by design, persistently, strategically, unchallenged, officially, enduring. There was a time when asking questions was not rebellion, but devotion. Early seekers compared texts, debated origins, and pursued understanding as a form of reverence. That environment did not survive the consolidation of authority. As doctrine hardened, curiosity shifted from virtue to threat. Alternative origin stories destabilized hierarchy. If creation could be discussed, it could be questioned. If questioned, it could be resisted. Knowledge became dangerous, not because it was false, but because it redistributed power. History records the response. Libraries burned, texts were outlawed, scholars were silenced, exiled, or executed. Official reasons varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Ideas that complicated divine authority were eliminated. The suppression of ancient knowledge was framed as protection of souls. In practice, it protected structure. By narrowing acceptable origins, institutions narrowed acceptable futures. Humanity was taught not to look backward too far or too closely. The Anunnaki narrative fell directly into this forbidden category. It suggested rulers before gods, systems before commandments, and design before destiny. Such ideas could not coexist with absolute creation. Heresy was not defined by falsity, but by inconvenience. Curiosity threatened unity. Unity preserved control. Once curiosity was criminalized, memory faded, stories simplified. The past was reorganized to serve belief rather than inquiry. Over generations, this reshaping became invisible, accepted as natural progression, rather than enforced silence. Yet persecution leaves traces. Burned books leave gaps. Executed scholars leave unanswered questions. And every missing voice hints at knowledge that once existed, challenged authority, and was removed for doing so. The war on forbidden knowledge was never about truth versus lies. It was about who decides which questions humanity is allowed to ask and which answers must remain buried, no matter how often they resurface across time. That decision shaped civilizations, molded belief, and narrowed imagination, ensuring obedience outlived understanding and silence endured, where curiosity once dared to speak, long before history learned to forget entirely, systematically, repeatedly, without mercy. Her record, ever, again, almost, completely, except fragments, echoes, and questions still surviving, quietly, stubbornly, unresolved. When Rome converted, it did not erase the old world, it absorbed it. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, temples once dedicated to pagan gods were not destroyed in fury or shame. They were renamed. Stones aligned to older stars were left standing, altars repurposed, rituals reframed. What changed was language, not location. Christian churches rose precisely where older sanctuaries had stood for centuries. The logic was practical and symbolic. These were already places of power, memory, and reverence. When pilgrims knew them, communities gathered there. To abandon them would have meant surrendering influence. To claim them ensured continuity. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. Rome understood that belief is easier to redirect than erase. The gods did not vanish. They were baptized, sacred calendars were adjusted, festivals renamed, and divine figures reintroduced under acceptable identities. What had once been openly acknowledged as inherited tradition became divine revelation. The architecture itself tells the story. Pagan columns hold Christian roofs. Ancient foundations support new doctrines. Beneath the surface, the old world remains intact, carrying meanings older than the faith proclaimed above it. This continuity suggests that Rome did not conquer paganism by disproving it. It neutralized it by assimilation. The sacred was not replaced, it was rebranded. And in that rebranding, power survived unbroken, tracing a line not from Christ alone, but from every authority that came before, and learned how to govern belief by preserving place while redefining purpose. As gods disappeared from public worship, new figures emerged to fill the space they left behind. Saints, angels, archangels, and messengers populated the spiritual hierarchy, each assigned domains, duties, and intercessory roles. The structure remained, only the labels changed. Angels deliver messages, enforce divine will, and descend from the sky. Saints oversee specific aspects of human life, protect cities, and receive offerings. These roles mirror those described in Anunnaki texts with unsettling precision. Authority is delegated. Jurisdictions are defined. Access to higher power is mediated. The Anunnaki were not distant creators. They were administrators. Later, religious figures functioned the same way, standing between humanity and an unreachable supreme source. The similarity raises an uncomfortable possibility that these are not new entities, but reinterpretations of older ones, adjusted to fit evolving doctrine. Descriptions overlap, beings of light, winged figures, voices that command rather than persuade. Even iconography echoes earlier depictions, refined to appear symbolic rather than literal. What once looked technological is reframed as miraculous. What once enforced order becomes divine mystery. The shift is subtle but decisive. By transforming rulers into spiritual guides, authority becomes unquestionable. To doubt a ruler invites rebellion. To doubt an angel invites damnation. And if the Anunnaki were remembered as they were, humanity could compare, analyze, and resist. By turning them into sacred intermediaries, their authority became eternal, abstract, and immune to scrutiny. The faces remained familiar. The truth behind them faded into reverence. The Church presents its authority as divinely granted, unprecedented, and absolute, yet its structure mirrors something far older. Hierarchies, initiations, restricted knowledge, and controlled access to truth did not originate with Christianity. They existed in ancient priesthoods, tasked with managing humanity under higher authority. In Sumer, priests did not speak for the people. They spoke for the gods. They interpreted commands, enforced order, and preserved records. Knowledge flowed downward selectively. Power was maintained through proximity to those above, and not equality below. Rome inherited this model intact. The Church did not invent governance of belief, it perfected it. Bishops replaced priest kings. Councils replaced divine assemblies. Doctrine replaced decree. The function remained unchanged. If the Anunnaki were rulers who delegated authority to human intermediaries, then priesthood was not spiritual vocation. It was administrative necessity. The Church, consciously or not, stepped into that role, maintaining continuity across collapse, conversion, and reform. This explains the obsession with succession, lineage, and unbroken authority. Power had to appear continuous, sanctioned, and eternal. Any break would invite doubt. Any origin too recent would invite comparison. Authority that claims to originate from heaven often traces its methods to earth. The Church's power feels ancient because it is. It carries echoes of systems designed to manage populations, regulate knowledge, and maintain obedience on behalf of forces humanity once knew directly and later remembered only through faith. If that inheritance is real, then Rome did not replace the gods. It assumed their position, guarding the same secrets, enforcing the same structures, and ensuring humanity never again mistook obedience for understanding or memory for myth. Long before modern geology debated ice ages and sea levels, humanity remembered a flood. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but as a defining rupture that ended one world and began another. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands, cultures separated by oceans preserve strikingly similar accounts of overwhelming waters, chosen survivors, and a deliberate restart. The Sumerian version stands apart in tone. It is not framed as moral punishment, but as administrative necessity. Humanity had grown numerous, noisy, and difficult to manage. The gods debated the problem, weighed consequences, and chose annihilation with preservation. A warning was issued privately. Instructions were given precisely. Survival was engineered. When compared to this account, later flood myths appear compressed. The Bible removes debate, simplifies motive, and assigns singular blame. Other cultures retain fragments the Hebrew text discards. Councils of gods, arguments among divine authorities, and survivors chosen for knowledge rather than righteousness. In Mesoamerican traditions, the world ends repeatedly through floods and fire. In Hindu texts, a figure is warned by a divine being to preserve life and sacred knowledge. Indigenous Australian stories speak of ancestral floods reshaping the land. These are not copies of Genesis. They echo something older. The similarities are too consistent to ignore. Water rises suddenly. Humanity is reduced. A remnant survives with instruction. Civilization resumes, altered, restrained, and watched. If memory alone produced these stories, variation would dominate. Instead, structure repeats. That repetition suggests not imagination, but experience shared, remembered, and retold long after details faded. The Anunnaki account does not stand isolated, it stands central, explaining why the flood is remembered everywhere, yet explained nowhere fully, leaving humanity with fragments of a reset it survived, but was never meant to understand again. Those fragments persist today as unease, recurring dreams, and myths that refuse disappearance, hinting humanity once witnessed coordinated destruction, selective mercy, and oversight beyond nature, then inherited survival without explanation, a guidance without consent, and memory stripped of context entirely across generations worldwide. Chosen survivors and forbidden knowledge. In every flood tradition, survival is not random. It is selective, deliberate, and purposeful. The Sumerian tablets are explicit. Certain humans were warned because they were useful. They possessed skills, knowledge, or genetic qualities worth preserving. Survival was not a reward for virtue, but a calculation. Those spared were instructed carefully. They were told what to build, what to carry, and what to remember. Seeds, animals, tools, Jews, and records were prioritized. This was not merely about continuing life, but about restarting civilization efficiently. After the waters receded, survivors did not wander blindly. They rebuilt cities, reestablished law, and resumed agriculture with surprising speed. This implies preparation. Knowledge had been protected, not rediscovered. Bloodlines mattered. Kingship lists trace rulers back to pre-flood figures, implying continuity rather than rebirth. Authority flowed through lineage, suggesting that certain families were entrusted with memory, others were denied. Later, religions moralized this selection, reframing survivors as righteous rather than prepared, yet fragments remain. Chosen families, sacred genealogies, and divine favor tied to ancestry echo the older logic of preservation. Forbidden knowledge appears repeatedly. Survivors knew too much. They understood cycles, construction, and governance. Over time, this knowledge was restricted, ritualized, and mythologized. What began as instruction became taboo. If humanity was reset, and survivors were custodians, not heroes. They carried forward controlled memory, enough to rebuild, but not enough to question origins. Knowledge was filtered, not shared equally. That imbalance shaped civilization. Power clustered around those closest to the past, while the majority inherited obedience without context. The flood did not erase humanity. It reorganized it, ensuring memory served authority rather than truth. This selective survival explains why ancient elites claimed divine descent, guarded secrets, and feared common understanding, because widespread knowledge would expose design, dependency, and manipulation, dissolving obedience and collapsing systems built to manage post-flood humanity through myth, ritual, and inherited authority across centuries, maintained by institutions, lineages, and narratives that discouraged inquiry and preserved hierarchy indefinitely through repetition, silence, and reverence without challenge. History's first reset button. The flood in the Anunnaki account is not framed as punishment. It is framed as correction. Humanity had exceeded acceptable limits, not morally but operationally. Population, noise, and independence disrupted order. The solution was not reform, but reset. This reframing changes everything. A reset implies prior versions, previous attempts, and future contingencies. It suggests oversight that monitors outcomes and intervenes when thresholds are crossed. The flood becomes a system response, not divine anger. Evidence of this logic appears in how civilization resumes. Survivors reintroduce agriculture, kingship, and worship rapidly, as if restoring defaults rather than inventing anew. Cultural memory feels constrained, focused on obedience and repetition, not exploration. The Bible's version removes this implication by emphasizing sin. Sin personalizes blame and absolves system designers. A reset becomes moral theater rather than management decision. If the flood was controlled, then it was planned. And if it was planned once, it can be planned again. The terrifying implication is not that humanity was punished, but that humanity is monitored. Ancient texts speak of cycles, ages, and endings that repeat. They warn not of apocalypse, but of renewal through destruction. Modern civilization, louder, larger, and more interconnected than any before, mirrors the conditions described before the first reset. If history has a reset button, then progress is conditional. Survival depends on remaining useful, compliant, or unnoticed. That possibility reframes extinction not as accident, but as option. The flood may not be ancient history. It may be precedent. And precedent, once established, does not fade. It waits dormant until conditions align again. This interpretation unsettles because it removes comfort. A managed reset implies surveillance, metrics, and thresholds humanity cannot see. Climate, technology, population, and defiance become variables, not virtues. If previous civilizations crossed limits unknowingly, modern confidence offers no immunity. The question becomes not whether a reset could occur, but whether warning would ever be given again in a world where belief replaces memory and silence replaces preparation. While authority controls narratives and outcomes without accountability for humanity at scale and speed again today. In theory, academia rewards curiosity. In practice, it rewards safety. Young researchers quickly learn which questions open doors and which quietly close them. The Anunnaki fall firmly into the second category. To pursue connections between ancient tablets, religious origins, and modern institutions is not illegal, but it is professionally radioactive. Scholars who attempt it are rarely censored outright. Instead, their work is marginalized. Papers are rejected for being speculative. Grant applications are denied for lacking relevance. Conferences suddenly have no available panels. And the message is never spoken clearly, but it is understood. Some subjects end careers. Ridicule plays an important role. Serious inquiry is reframed as fringe obsession. Researchers are labeled conspiratorial, regardless of methodology. Once that label sticks, their work becomes invisible. Citation disappears. Collaboration dries up. Silence replaces debate. This is not unique to Anunnaki research. Academia has long enforced boundaries around acceptable narratives. Paradigms protect themselves. Challenges to foundational timelines or origins threaten entire disciplines built on continuity. If early assumptions collapse, so does authority. Tenured scholars may survive such inquiry. Students and early career researchers cannot. The cost is too high. Safer topics promise publication, stability, and respect. Forbidden ones offer isolation. As a result, absence becomes evidence, not because proof is lacking, but because inquiry is discouraged. When entire questions vanish from serious study, it is not because they were answered, but because they were deemed too disruptive to pursue. Silence enforced through professional consequence rather than decree ensures uncomfortable possibilities remain unexplored. Knowledge does not need suppression when ambition and fear perform the task efficiently on their own. Translation is never neutral. Every choice shapes meaning. With ancient text, fragmentation becomes an effective filter. Lines are translated independently, context is removed, connections are discouraged. The result is data without narrative. Sumerian tablets are often presented as isolated hymns, inventories, or myths, and that rarely are they read together as a coherent account. When they are, uncomfortable patterns emerge, repeated descriptions of sky beings, technical creation, and governance structures. Fragmentation prevents that synthesis. Linguistic uncertainty is frequently cited. Words are said to lack direct equivalence. Meanings are debated endlessly. Yet this caution disappears when translations support accepted history. Precision becomes flexible when outcomes align with doctrine. By avoiding narrative reconstruction, scholars avoid implication. Facts exist, but they do not point anywhere. A flood is a flood. A god is a god. Context dissolves into abstraction. Science values data, but stories give data power. Remove the story and evidence loses direction. The Anunnaki narrative requires story to be seen at all. Without it, the tablets remain curiosities rather than challenges. This selective rigor creates an illusion of objectivity. In reality, it preserves comfort. Fragmentation ensures no single conclusion threatens the whole. The price is understanding. What remains is science stripped of consequence, information without interpretation, knowledge without meaning, and beneath it all, the quiet suspicion that coherence has been deliberately avoided, not because it is impossible, but because it is inconvenient. Every field has forbidden questions. They're not banned, but ignored. They receive no funding, no mentorship, no serious engagement. In ancient history, these questions cluster around origin, authority, and continuity. Why do so many cultures share the same foundational stories? Why do older records contradict later ones? Or why do institutions respond with silence rather than explanation? These questions linger unanswered, not due to lack of curiosity, but lack of permission. Silence becomes a boundary. It signals where inquiry must stop. When scholars hesitate to ask obvious questions, absence speaks louder than denial. It suggests risk. If the Anunnaki narrative were easily disproven, it would be debated openly. Refutation strengthens confidence. Avoidance weakens it. When silence persists across institutions, generations, and disciplines, it stops looking accidental. Modern scholarship prides itself on skepticism, yet accepts foundational assumptions without challenge. Timelines are inherited. Narratives are repeated. Origins are treated as settled despite unresolved contradictions. The fear is not that the answers are strange. History is full of strangeness. The fear is that the answers might be coherent. Coherence threatens revision. Revision threatens authority. Silence then becomes a defense mechanism. It protects careers, institutions, and belief systems from destabilization. But it also leaves a void where explanation should be. And in that void, suspicion grows. Because when questions remain unasked long enough, humanity begins to wonder whether ignorance is natural or carefully maintained to preserve a version of history too fragile to withstand its own past. The Vatican presents itself as the heart of Christianity, born from apostolic succession and sanctified by time. Yet its authority did not emerge from a vacuum. Long before Christianity formalized belief, systems of knowledge-keeping, ritual management, and population control already existed across the ancient world. Rome did not invent these systems. it inherited them. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Greece, priesthoods functioned as intermediaries between humanity and higher powers. They guarded calendars, astronomical knowledge, legal traditions, and origin stories. Access was restricted, truth was tiered. Authority flowed downward from those closest to the source. When empires fell, these systems adapted, transferring power rather than losing it. As Rome absorbed cultures, it also absorbed their structures. Temples became churches, priests became clergy. Sacred knowledge was reorganized, not abandoned. Christianity offered a unifying narrative, but the machinery beneath it was ancient. The Vatican's emphasis on lineage, secrecy, and unbroken authority mirrors these older institutions precisely. Apostolic succession resembles priestly inheritance. Councils echo divine assemblies. Doctrine replaces decree. If this continuity is real, then Vatican authority predates Christianity itself. It is not solely a spiritual creation, but the latest expression of an ancient role: custodian of origin knowledge, manager of belief, and mediator between humanity and forces it once encountered directly. The church did not begin history. It positioned itself at the center of it, standing on foundations laid long before Christ, ensuring that whatever truths survived collapse would pass through Rome's hands first. This perspective reframes early Christianity not as a beginning, but as a transition, a moment when ancient authority adopted new language to survive a changing world. By redefining itself as eternal truth, the institution preserved control while appearing transformed. The foundation remained untouched, hidden beneath faith, ritual, and continuity that few were encouraged to question openly. Those who traced its roots too far back often found doors closed, records missing, and warnings delivered quietly but unmistakably. History rewarded silence more than insight, and Rome understood that lesson well. The church presents itself as a shepherd, guiding humanity toward salvation. Yet its behavior across centuries suggests a different role. Rather than leading people toward truth, it has consistently positioned itself as a gatekeeper, deciding which knowledge is safe, which is dangerous, and which must remain hidden. Custodianship implies responsibility, not intimacy. For a guardian does not explain what it protects, it ensures others cannot access it unsupervised. The Vatican's relationship with ancient texts, archives, and alternative origin stories fits this pattern precisely. Dangerous truths are not those that are false, but those that disrupt structure. If humanity understood its origins differently, authority would shift, belief would decentralize, institutions built on exclusive interpretation would weaken. By controlling scripture, translation, and canon, the church curated reality itself. What people believed about their beginning determined how they understood obedience, sin, and purpose. Guidance was less about spiritual growth and more about stability. This reframing casts doctrine as containment. Ritual becomes repetition, designed to reinforce boundaries. Faith becomes trust in what is withheld as much as what is revealed. If the church were merely a shepherd, transparency would strengthen belief. Instead, secrecy persists. That secrecy suggests the presence of knowledge powerful enough to destabilize faith if encountered without mediation. Guardianship explains silence, it explains restriction, it explains why questions about ancient origins are neither answered nor denied. They are simply managed, kept at a distance, protected from exposure. The unsettling implication is that the church knows more than it teaches, and that its primary role has never been to reveal humanity's past, but to ensure it never remembers too much. Such a role would make sense if the past contained mechanisms of control humanity was never meant to reclaim. Knowledge, once widespread, cannot be recollected. It can only be regulated, filtered, and delayed until memory fades. And in that fading, authority becomes indispensable. The guardian remains long after the shepherd should have left. History rarely notices the difference. By then, memory is already gone. If the Anunnaki narrative reflects reality even partially, then the implications are profound. Humanity's origin shifts from divine miracle to engineered outcome. Faith transforms from relationship to compliance. History becomes managed memory rather than spontaneous unfolding. Religions would no longer be unique revelations, but curated interpretations layered over older truths. Authority would appear inherited, not absolute. The Vatican and institutions like it would be seen not as spiritual beginnings, but as administrators of continuity. This reframing does not demand disbelief. It demands reevaluation. Belief systems would need to confront the possibility that their foundations were shaped by necessity, power, and survival, rather than pure transcendence. Humanity's place in the universe would also change. We would no longer be central creations, but participants in a larger system we barely understand. Purpose would be assigned before it was chosen. Free will would exist, but within boundaries set long ago. This is why the question is resisted so fiercely. It destabilizes comfort. It removes moral simplicity. It replaces certainty with context. If origins are controlled, then futures may be as well. Progress becomes conditional. Advancement becomes monitored. The past stops being sacred and becomes instructive. The most unsettling implication is not loss of faith, but loss of innocence. Humanity would have to accept that it has been managed before, reset before, and possibly prepared for outcomes yet to come. If this is true, everything changes, not because belief collapses, but because memory returns. And with memory comes responsibility, curiosity, and the dangerous possibility that humanity might finally ask, not who created it, but why and for what purpose, in a universe far less comforting than Scripture ever promised. Such a realization would force history, science, and faith into the same conversation for the first time. The separation between myth and record would collapse, leaving humanity to confront a past that was hidden not to protect it, but to control it. And control, once revealed, can never feel divine again. It becomes historical, fragile, and accountable, like every system humanity has ever inherited before. Ancient control systems were never abandoned. They evolved. The mechanisms described in the Anunnaki tablets, restricted knowledge, hierarchical authority, selective memory, did not vanish with the fall of ancient cities. They adapted to new languages, new technologies, and new belief systems, surviving because they worked. Modern power no longer announces itself as divine, but it still relies on managed narratives. Education defines acceptable history. Media filters context. Institutions decide which truths are destabilizing and which are harmless. The method remains the same: shape understanding to preserve order. Religion once served this role openly. Today, ideology, economics, and science share the burden. Each claims objectivity while quietly enforcing boundaries. Question too deeply and access disappears. Push too hard and credibility erodes. The Anunnaki narrative matters because it exposes continuity. It suggests that humanity has always been governed through belief management rather than force alone. The tools changed, but the objective remained stability through obedience. Ancient priesthoods controlled calendars and cosmology. Modern institutions control data and interpretation. Both decide what the public is ready to know. If this system has persisted for thousands of years, then humanity has never been truly free to define its own origin. Identity was inherited, not chosen. Remembering this history matters because it reframes modern power as ancient strategy. What feels new is often repetition. What feels natural is often designed. The past does not stay buried when its patterns still shape the present. Understanding ancient control systems is not about revisiting myth. It is about recognizing architecture that still governs belief, obedience, and perception today, quietly, efficiently, and without needing to announce itself as authority anymore. The tablets describe departure, not disappearance. The Anunnaki withdrew, returned, intervened, and observed. Their presence was cyclical, not permanent. This detail often goes unnoticed, yet it carries unsettling implications. Ancient texts speak of watchers, of eyes in the sky, of beings who no longer rule directly but remain aware. Symbols persist across cultures: winged discs, all-seeing eyes, descending lights. Over time, these became metaphors, then decorations, then dismissed relics. Modern sightings echo ancient descriptions with disturbing familiarity, objects that defy explanation. Encounters framed as hallucination or technology. Authority responds with denial, ridicule, and silence, the same tools used for ancient knowledge. If oversight once existed, why assume it ended? Control systems rarely dismantle themselves completely. They retreat, adapt, and monitor from distance. The Anunnaki may not rule openly because they no longer need to. Humanity now enforces its own boundaries, polices its own curiosity, and defends narratives without external intervention. This possibility reframes absence as success. Oversight becomes invisible when control is internalized. Whether the Anunnaki remain physical beings or symbolic representations of higher authority matters less than the pattern. Someone once managed humanity. That management left structures that still function. The unsettling thought is not that they remain among us, but that they no longer need to be. Their legacy may be self-sustaining, embedded in systems humanity mistakes for progress, governance, and order. Every civilization chooses what to remember and what to forget. The Anunnaki narrative suggests forgetting was not accidental. It was encouraged, enforced, and ritualized until memory became myth and myth became harmless. The truth humanity was never meant to remember is not the existence of ancient beings, but the nature of control. Humanity was shaped, guided, reset, and released with limits. Remembering this truth threatens comfort. It replaces divine certainty with historical contingency. It asks humanity to accept that its origins were not sacred moments, but decisions. If rediscovery is inevitable, then suppression only delayed the question. Tablets resurface, patterns repeat, curiosity returns. Perhaps forgetting was always temporary. Perhaps memory fades, but never disappears completely. It waits for the moment when systems weaken and questions become unavoidable. If humanity was once managed, then understanding that past is the first step toward refusing repetition or toward accepting it fully. The haunting question remains unanswered. What if rediscovering this truth was not a threat, but a test? What if humanity was always meant to reach a point where it could face its origins without collapse? In that case, the secrecy, the silence, and the suppression were not eternal barriers, but thresholds. And beyond them lies a past that refuses to stay buried, asking whether humanity is finally ready to remember who shaped it, why it was shaped, and what that means for a future no longer protected by ignorance, faith, or forgetting.